Hello, welcome to this panel. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Ben Hunt. I'm the BBC's LGBT correspondent, and I'm very, very excited to be here today for this conversation during Pride Month. We're going to be talking a lot around Pride, and especially about Pride through a football lens. If you don't know, every year during the month of June, the LGBT community celebrates in a number of different ways. Across the globe, various events are held during this special month as a way of recognizing the influence that LGBT people have had around the world. And today, like I said, we're going to be looking at Pride through a football lens, because there is an acknowledgement that more needs to be done in furthering LGBT inclusion in football and ultimately eliminating homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia from the game. There have been lots of different campaigns. We've had the Rainbow Latents campaign, which has grown over the past few years in both professional and grassroots elements, where players, coaches, referees, officials, and countless volunteers show their support by wearing rainbow laces or captain armbands. But ultimately, when we're looking at this situation, I think we can all understand that there are very few players who have come out in the top flight of the men's game since Justin 22 years ago. And those who have tended to opt for doing so only once retired. Women's game, completely different. Many players who are open about their sexual orientation, and there are so many examples of players who are comfortable in themselves and in their stories. And I know that I've reported on a few of them. However, with stereotyping and increased exposure of the professionalization of the women's game, visibility does bring different challenges. So that brings us to today. This is our opportunity to have a real, authentic conversation about the state of the game as it pertains to LGBT inclusion and looking at what more can be done, what can change. So who are our panelists? We've got Chris Ramsey, the QPR's head of coaching. Anita Asanta is a former Chelsea and England player. Nicky Bandini is a broadcaster and football writer. Robbie De Santos is Director of Sport at Stonewall. And we've got Jehmeil Lemonius, who is the Diversity and Inclusion Officer at the Football Association. Welcome to you all. We're going to get you to do a bit more of an introduction about yourselves and your experiences. And why don't we do that along with our first question, which is going to be LGBT inclusion in elite football. Where are we now and where do we need to be? Chris, I'm going to start with you.
I'm actually the technical director at QPR as well as the head of coaching. QPR is quite a diverse club in nearly everything we do. I would have to say that someone who's been in the game for, this is my 42nd year, there's been a lot of ignorance around this issue, and I'm not excluding myself from it at all. My greatest awareness of the issue started really in 1994 when I managed Newham Ladies. And it was just when the women's football was starting to have paid coaches and stuff like that. So I did that for 3 years, and it opened my eyes quite a bit to the issues that were happening in those days. You know, I was merrily just trotted into a football club and coaching the people that were there. But along the way, every weekend, we would meet different issues that opened my eyes to things that probably I didn't realise.
What kind of issues were you seeing?
Pardon?
What kind of issues were you seeing?
There was teams called WAS teams. So I don't know if you've heard that. We are straight, you know, and things like that, and just general comments that you flippantly people would flippantly use. I mean, listen, it would actually be a lie of me or an ignorant of me to say that homophobia and issues like that were not normalised when I was growing up, because I grew up in the 70s in Islington, in Holloway. So I was in an all-boys school, and the language was just normalised. And I think there has been a lot of education, which has educated me to be where I am as regards looking at people's issues and taking on board what actually needs to be changed or addressed. And you know, I feel that I'm miles away from it, and I think therefore there are other people that are even further away than I am. So to try and change things is also to try to give people equal opportunities without judging people for anything other than their abilities in what you're asking them to do.
Nice. Thank you for that. Anita, I'm going to come to you next. Tell us a bit more about yourself and where are we now and what can change?
Yeah, well, I've played for Arsenal. That's the club I grew up playing for. As a youngster, I played abroad. I played in the USA for 3 years, played in Sweden for 6 years. And I think it's opened myself up to, lots of discussions around LGBTQ plus, inclusion, diversity, all these issues. And I think when I started in football as an amateur, where the game wasn't as professional, it kind of was taboo, a little bit to, if you're a gay woman in football, it was like, well, that was the stereotype anyway. So I think for those girls and women that participated at the time, that was a home for them anyway, because it was just widely accepted, rightly or wrongly, with the taboos associated with the sport at the time. But now, as the game's getting more professional, you're starting to see a shift. Yes, it's always been considered more inclusive, but with the visibility and the interest that comes from commercial sponsorship and TV media, you're seeing that some girls are also more self-aware about their image and their personality, their persona, and the limitations that come with that because of negative stereotyping related to LGBTQ plus. So I think I've seen that kind of transition happen as well, where we need to sort of find a way to, again, like Chris mentioned, educate, have these discussions openly, and start with the youth and youngsters coming in as well, because ultimately they will be the change for the future of the game as well. Not to say that it shouldn't happen now. I think it is happening more and more now. But again, because it's been so normalized and accepted within the women's game, we can't forget that we still got work to do regardless. We're trying to lead by example. Doesn't mean that there aren't pockets where there are girls that still feel insecure to come out, be themselves in these spaces.
Just wondering if you are seeing that younger generations are a lot more accepted and more welcoming, because my side hustle, I've got a confidence academy for young people where I go around the country and teach young people how to be more confident in themselves. And I was in one school the other day in Leeds where I had a class of 9 to 12-year-olds, about 30 of them, and not a single one identified as straight. They were all either pansexual or bisexual. So I was just wondering, like, whether you see that younger generations within either sides of the game are more accepting and more welcome of these changes than older.
Yeah, I would agree. I do think youngsters are more open and receptive to information and knowledge. And obviously we're living in a more globalized world today where we've got access to information so quickly. We can unify, we can discuss and debate. And you're seeing that kind of activism coming from youngsters. I mean, you're seeing it in the Black Lives Matter movement. You're seeing it in other areas of society, environmental issues. They're the ones leading the charge. And that's a positive for me. That is one positive about moving this discussion forward, especially for the game moving forward.
Nice. Nicky, where are we currently at with the game and what could change?
That's a big question, where we're at with the game. Question. I think a lot can change. So I'm transgender. I have been working as a sports journalist since 2006. Transition is not a thing that happens quickly, and so that's something that I've been going through over several years. But I made, I guess, the most public part of my transition, the part of coming out to readers last year. So I'm sort of still finding out myself, in some senses, where we're at with the game and where people are in terms of their acceptance and their more than acceptance, I think, just awareness of trans people and just how we fit into the whole of society in some ways, but certainly how to welcome us into sporting spaces. I have to say, I'm making that sound like it's something huge and very sort of complicated, when in lots of ways it isn't. And in fact, I've been very pleasantly surprised by how welcoming the industry has been to me, certainly the journalistic industry. Of course, I'm about to say no one batted an eyelid. I'm certain eyelids were batted, but I really haven't run into much hostility on a personal level. I think that there is still plenty to be done in terms of inclusion within the sport, and I mean that for all LGBT people, certainly not just trans people. And it's one of the things that I wrote about in my coming out piece, as it were, was about the fact that we still haven't had, that there are currently no players in elite men's football who are openly out as LGBT, and it's just so statistically improbable that, of course, it makes you question why someone wouldn't want to come out. And I think there's a whole lot of reasons we can get into for why someone wouldn't want to come out. I can think of lots of reasons why I personally might not have come out if it's not so much harder to not come out when you're transgender because of visible aspects of that process, I guess. So I certainly don't say that in a way to make it sound like I think anyone should be under pressure to, because I don't. That's the last thing I think. But I do think football has questions to answer about why people still aren't in 2020 when, as you say, all across the country, actually young people really aren't that bothered.
I think it's really interesting what you said around you haven't received much hostility, especially in this time when we're seeing trans lives being under debate more than ever. Do you think something prevented you from receiving like a negative backlash?
I mean, yes, lots of things. I think that I was, you could say fortunate, you could say cowardly, because I could have come out sooner, I'm sure, but I had to put myself in a position in my career where I had an established position where I was well liked prior to coming out, and I'm certain that made it easier for me. I know personally transgender people in a variety of professions who have been set back professionally by coming out, and how complicated that is, and perhaps I benefited from the stage in my career I was at when I did that, from the fact that I do various podcasts where I guess some listeners, for whatever reason, I can't tell you why, seem to think fondly of me, and therefore were willing to welcome me, and that helps. I think having a group of people who are ready to support you right off the bat helps other people come along with it, maybe. You know, the optimistic part of me wants to say it's just because society is changing, and actually, certainly here in the UK, I think that despite what people can fall into online, and there certainly has been, even in the last few days, plenty of stuff online to make people feel excluded in society if you spend too long on Twitter and other social media. In reality, my experience certainly has been that actually most people in Britain, and that is most, it's not all, because I've been on the receiving end of some bad stuff too in my sort of real life, as it were, but most people in the UK are pretty accepting.
Lovely to hear that. Thank you. Robbie, over to you. This is literally your job. Tell us about where we're at with LGBT inclusion in football.
Oh, and I'm so lucky to have this job. It's such an honour to work with such an amazing group of people. I think what I've kind of reflected over the last, so I've been working on Stonewall's work on sport for the last 4 or 5 years. I helped take the Rainbow Laces campaign from the campaign that Paddy Power kind of came up with about 7 years ago, and I've made it into a campaign that's about all levels of sport, all sports, all genders, all sexualities. It's not just about kind of gay top flight footballers and do they exist and when are they going to come out. I've seen a lot of change in the last 4 or 5 years. I think what I'd particularly kind of acknowledge is that football is really game to do this well. I think football kind of acknowledges that they, as the kind of the biggest sport by a long way in this country, they've got a huge social responsibility to change society through their work. They've got a huge kind of platform, and because they kind of get a lot more negative attention than other sports, I think there's a lot more kind of pressure on them to do it well. So I've really seen just an amazing movement across football at all levels of football. So from the Premier League and the FA, really kind of taking this on at a kind of institutional level through to the grassroots as well, and just seeing the way that we ship hundreds of thousands of Rainbow Laces every year to communities, and just seeing the way that the kind of the grassroots across football get on board with this and kind of really energized around it, really kind of trying to outdo competitor counties, competitor clubs. It's just incredible. So I look forward to November every year when the Rainbow Laces campaign comes around. It's like Pride, but in the winter, and it's just bringing so much sunshine and joy to communities. So yeah, incredible kind of how much has changed, but there's still a long way to go before LGBT people feel truly safe at every level in football. So I think hopefully we'll kind of unpick some of those areas a bit more over the course of this panel.
I love that you said about a winter pride. Yes, bring me on a winter pride. Is anything to look forward to, please? Jay, over to you. Where do you think we're currently at with LGBT inclusion in sport? Where do you think we need to be?
Hey, so yeah, I'm Jay, and I'm the Diversity and Inclusion Officer at the FA, but I'm also the captain of Stonewall FC, who are the world's most successful LGBT inclusive football team. I think I just want to kind of echo a few points that the other panelists have just spoken about. I think, particularly for me, I've worked in football or sports over the course of the last 5 years. And even before that, studying at university, I sort of studied sports development and specifically tried to hone in on the LGBT inclusion, particularly my dissertation and stuff. And I remember doing my dissertation and trying to find research, trying to find visibility and not being able to find it anywhere. So now we sort of discussed the Rainbow Lasers campaign, which particularly over the last 5 years has really gathered so much support. It's now a campaign which, when it comes round in November, you're not just seeing support from WSL clubs, you're looking at support from grassroots clubs, to elite professional athletes in the men's game, to all forms of sports. And I don't think sports was in a position to do that 5 years ago. I think the support that sort of developed definitely and absolutely a movement, and we've come a long way to be able to have these conversations. But I think as we've touched upon, we're not quite there yet. I think if you look at sort of trans inclusion more broadly, when specifically try and break down the LGBT, those experiences have a massive disparity between some of the experiences of LGB people. And yeah, I think it's just the movement, and I think where we need to go from this is to try and empower people to look at how we can give them the tools and the confidence to be able to create those inclusive environments. Because what we're talking about here is culture shift. We know we're changing hearts and minds. We know that we've shifted kind of the discourse around whether people feel like LGBT people belong in sports. We've got that visibility. We've got those changing hearts and minds. Now we're talking about culture shift, and that doesn't happen overnight. I think it's all about sort of putting in place pensions and empowerment methods to be able to give people the tools and the confidence to create that change within football.
Love that. So I want to talk about role models a bit. I think role models are really important. When I was growing up, I remember being confused that you could actually be black and gay. I was even more confused you could be black, gay, and sporty. Even more confused you could be black, gay, sporty with a deep voice. It just didn't make any sense to me. And when I was kind of looking for a role model, the only person I really found that was a bit like me was Derek from Big Brother, Derek Lord, who was an ultra-conservative, fox hunting, very posh sounding guy. And I had nothing in comparison with him apart from the fact that we were both black and gay. I just wanted someone to copy in terms of mannerisms and how they were living their life. So I reached out to him. I wonder if within the context of sport, we could talk around, specifically in football, the idea that for a young person growing up, who is the role model? Like, who is there that they can kind of look up to? Maybe you could discuss some of your role models and also where else needs to change within all levels of football when it comes to role models and allies. Maybe we'll go to Robbie first.
Sorry, one sec, the mute button. So I'll just be really honest. Like, I'm not a huge football fan, and I grew up in a football family. And so I'm from Edinburgh. My family are all Hibs fans. I got dragged along to all of the games every weekend. It was, yeah, not my cup of tea. But actually, I think it was the lack of role models that I knew from a really early age that I wasn't the same as everyone else. I didn't feel like I fitted in that football environment. And really that kind of lack of role models, even like kind of role models in the stadium with me, people who were a bit softer, a bit gentler. It was just so kind of bullish and loud and rowdy. I didn't feel like it was for me. So I think I'm one of those people who really whose life course took the direction it did because of a lack of role models. I guess kind of my reflection on role models today is that that's kind of why we run Rainbow Laces, because even though we can't force and we don't want to force any gay or bi male players to kind of come out and be a role model, that's too much pressure for any one person to have on their shoulders. The idea shouldn't be that you have there should be other ways of kind of showing that people are welcome and accepted without people having to be out there and be those kind of like literal role models. So kind of wearing rainbow laces, encouraging players with that kind of public profile who are role models already to so many people, to talk about being LGBT in sport, to kind of talk about accepting others, I think is just as important, if not more important, kind of showing that sport is welcoming, that there is a place for everyone, without kind of putting that onus on the individual to kind of be stuck out there on their own and waiting for people to kind of accept them.
Love that. Jay, you're a lot like me in this. Talk me through some of the things you had growing up. Who were your role models? Where do you think we need to be now?
Yeah, I completely resonated with a lot of what you said, Ben. Sort of growing up, being black, gay, footballer, and knowing I was different, but whilst football was my safe space, sort of the more I understood my identity, the less of a safe space football became for me. And I kind of grew up, and I look back at my time now, I without a doubt, I always say that football and coming out changed my life. And for me, sort of the older I got, the more I understood sort of my sexual orientation, the impact that had on my experience. The more I understood that, particularly when I was going through a talent pathway when I was younger, that crossroads that I had of being gay and playing football absolutely kind of blew up for me. And my motivation to kind of try and play football at the highest level definitely diminished the more I sort of understood. Or the more I felt at the time, sort of those two elements of identity couldn't be reconciled. But then I got older and I went to university and sort of really fell in love with the game. And I think the more that I understand that, the more powerful sort of role models have for me now than back then. I grew up in a single mother household also, so in terms of having a black male role model in my life, I still really struggle sometimes to reconnect with role model figures who are particularly black gay men. And I sometimes, particularly if I really think about role models, I automatically sometimes just directly go to women, particularly black women, because that's who I grew up with, my mum. So yeah, I think they're incredibly powerful. And I don't know where I'd be now if the tragic thing that happened to Justin Fashanu never actually happened. And he ended up having a successful career, and he sort of normalised being in football as a gay black man for me. Would I be an elite athlete? Who knows? But for me, I feel like that was definitely taken away from me, or that opportunity was definitely I took away from myself because I didn't have that kind of thing to sort of strive towards, because I was always telling myself that this isn't the space for me. So yeah, I think incredibly powerful, and I think it's why Robbie touched upon campaigns like the Rainbow Laces campaign. Seeing visible shows of support from people at the really top end is so incredibly powerful, whatever that looks like, whether it's visible, whether it's just a conversation on an open door. They can be so powerful. And yeah, being a role model isn't just about sort of those little things also.
Love that. I might go to Chris next. Thinking about your role within football, would you say that you're a role model to people? How are you helping people to come on through and live their lives?
Well, listen, believe it or not, I grew up in the 70s, glam rock. A lot of the Mark Bolans and David Bowies and people like that, Mick Jaggers and all those people in those days have all insinuated about their bisexuality and things like that. So a lot of those people back in those days were very brave in the way that they were very open about how they lived their life. So it's important to also look at those people and look at the people that we've grown up with and how we accepted them in those days. Although probably not accepted as much as they could have been, because in the days that I played, it was very macho, and it wasn't an area where people could easily be open about anything, far less, being gay or wanting to trans. In our situation now, dealing with the young players, it's about acceptance within anything, really, about teaching people about acceptance and not judging people by what you think is inverted commas, normal. It's about accepting people for what they want to do, what they want to be. One of the questions that somebody asked me about before, when I was doing an article on racism, and I said, well, to me, apart from racism, the two deepest problems that we do have in football are homophobia and sexism, because it cuts across all cultures. So if we were all green, those two things would still be there. So it's important to realise that it's actually something that we need to think of in a deeper fashion, because they're always there and they always have been there. And when we talk about the younger generation at the moment, I think what's good about the younger generation, that they're more open to explore, their sexuality. So they don't have to make an early decisions about what they do or how they are, and they tend to be a little bit more accepting of difference from them. But one of the things we do have is we do have an older generation of fans who are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, who still have views from before, and are still very vocal on the when you look at the abuse that gets handed out. It's not always young people. It's usually men in their 50s that you would look at, grandfathers, fathers, that are actually giving out the abuse. And although there has been a lot of change, one of the questions that I would want to put forward to anybody is, although we look at, there's more people that are accepting of a difference. Is it the fact, is there been a big change, or have the people that originally would have been supporting these issues are now revealing themselves more? So there's more people are now saying, yeah, this is what I believe. I'm not going to hide it anymore. I'm actually going to speak up. So we have to be careful that we're thinking that people have now all of a sudden changed and now thinking everything's starting to be better. My personal belief is I've seen people that I knew had views of acceptance, and now starting to actually shine their light now instead of hiding it, and which is a good thing, but we still have to be careful that we're not going to let people off the hook for not having acceptance.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was looking through Arsenal's post, was it yesterday, for Pride weekend, and just seeing some of the ignorant comments and whatnot. I was like, wow. But for me, it's so wild that people feel so free to share those opinions in public still. And I suppose it's a reflection on the wider game as well, in that if this kind of ignorance is so freely spread and so easily shared, then what must it be like to be at the center of that media storm, knowing that this is what's potentially on the outside if you were to come out? Nicky, I might come to you next. Role models. What do you think about them? Who were yours growing up? Where do we need to be?
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on what you were just talking about with Chris there, I mean, that's definitely a really sort of important point I think Chris makes. I think there's truth in that actually part of what's happened is just that the people who weirdly were sort of supportive but quiet before are now supportive and vocal. And, even when I said earlier about having not faced a lot of hostility since coming out, it doesn't mean I haven't seen horrible comments underneath articles, underneath YouTube videos, things like that. Those are out there. And perhaps when I sort of talk about my experience, I'm aided just by the fact of having been a football journalist for more than a decade before I came out. And so I guess nasty comments in comment sections maybe roll off me a little bit easier than they would for some people, because I've been dealing with it just because I, wrote an article about your team for the last decade. I think in terms of role models, for me as a trans woman in her mid-30s, there was nothing growing up. I mean, the closest thing there was to even an acknowledgement of trans existence in my life when I was a kid was Jerry Springer, which was not a positive role modeling of trans people. So yeah, I didn't have that when I was growing up at all. And even now within sport, that's basically non-existent. There are a few other people working in sports journalism and internationally, and in all honesty, most of them I became aware of only after I came out. Grace Robertson is a football writer in the UK. Christina Carl covers baseball in the United States. There are a few of us, but there's not many. When I think about role models, they tend to fit into different categories of people who I found inspiring, who weren't like me, but maybe I saw some things that could relate to. I mean, for a recent one, who is a trans woman who I find inspiring, Laverne Cox, certainly. I mean, she being sort of just such a wonderful seeming person. Of course, you don't know so much on the telly, but she seems to be, and she's so open and herself that she's very easy to look up to. And I think even people who were not LGBT, but for instance, women who were sort of the early pioneers of being women in sports journalism were inspiring to me, like Jackie Oatley when she first did Match of the Day. That was, I was a long way from self-acceptance when that happened, but I still was reading about it obsessively and was so excited to see this woman just breaking into it and being in a space where we'd only heard men's voices up to that point. So it's a mix for me. I think within football specifically, finding, certainly within men's football, finding prominent LGBT people to look up to has not been easy. The women's game obviously has been a very different picture, and especially recently, and it was an amazing summer for that with the World Cup and Megan Rapinoe and everyone else. But I think within football specifically, it's been a very, very shallow pool to this point.
Yes, and speaking about the women's game, let's go straight to Anita. Role models, who were yours? You're a role model for many people out there. So what has that been like? How are you helping other people to kind of find themselves, accept themselves, love themselves, be themselves, all of that?
Yeah, I think the most important part is the visibility, isn't it? And the narratives. When I entered the game, women's football is still largely a marginalized sport. So my role models existed around me in my immediate circles, and I looked up to them, but it didn't necessarily prepare me for wider society and how I would feel comfortable at coming out, because I didn't come out much until later in my adulthood. So it goes to show that, now we're having visible role models who are actually having the platform and using it. And that takes them having courage and being brave enough to do it as well. But it also, it takes one person to start a movement. And so to have people like Megan Rapinoe or, Casey Stoney own their narrative, be given the platform to share their story, that allows more people to engage with them also and engage with the issue. I couldn't do that before in my, bubble where the game wasn't even professional and it didn't get visibility on television or in print media. But the more that's happening, the more we're able to, young people can look up to these players as well and start having those conversations in their own circles, whether it be at grassroots in elite football or not. So for me, I remember, Billie Jean King, and I looked at other sports for where they existed, Navratilova, who were there, but they were also successful. So, not to say they didn't get negativity, but, with success, maybe their experiences might be different to someone else who exists within grassroots or in another space where the support isn't there, or the discussions aren't really happening. But again, it crosses, it's intersectional with race, with, gender, all these things. And we're still a long way from that. I think you don't see, black women, for example, sports people who are LGBT and it's super open, although it's happening, the shift is happening, and that is a positive trend. But we just need to keep it happening, and we need to keep opening up those spaces for those people who don't normally get the light shine on them, to have these discussions in all honesty. And I think it's great that we're able to place sometimes athletes with these issues, but I also think it's important that we start to, instead of being the norm and other, start to include us as part of normal society. So, whether you have visible gay, LGBT plus athletes or celebrities that are just on, Match of the Day with everybody else, you're bringing those people into a normal setting that they would exist in normal life. We meet straight people, we meet gay people, trans people, and that's a part of our everyday life in society. And we need to have that represented on those platforms where the audiences are massive as well.
I love that. Yeah, for me, it's all about the usualization of experiences, making things seem so usual that it's almost boring. It's like you don't focus on those minute details. However, I suppose I might come to Jay on this. If we're looking at the need to kind of put people in positions that really inspire people and make change happen, what are some of the barriers that are stopping somebody from coming out? We've got these fabulous organizations, we've got these opportunities available for them, we've got media supportive. Why still are we in this position where we're even talking about all of this?
I think there's a number of reasons why people might not feel comfortable coming out. I think obviously for everybody, and particularly people on this panel, understand coming out being such a personal journey for everybody, and everybody approaches that journey in their own way. I think if you look at it from an athlete perspective, ultimately you train every day, 5 days a week, 5 times a week, including matches a weekend. Ultimately, that's your goal. That's what you sort of dedicated your life to do. And ultimately, that's all you want to be. You want to be an athlete. You don't want to be known as Jay, gay Premier League footballer. You just want to be known as the Premier League footballer who was a good fullback. And ultimately, that's their identity in that moment in time. And that may change and fluctuate in different spaces. So obviously, you see trend of sort of players coming out at the back end of their careers. Because that's, for them, their priority in that moment in time has changed. And so as you look beyond your career and you're not thinking about being an athlete sort of 100 times every single 7 days a week, you then try to explore the relevance of your identity. And that's probably why you see it more towards the back end of their career. But ultimately, athletes just want to be just that, and that's athletes. And I think it takes a very unique person to sort of put their head up the parapet and be like, I want to be the first, and I want to be the poster child. And ultimately, not everybody wants to do that. So again, like I think we talk about what can we do. There's nothing we can do, particularly when you're looking at a person's personal journey. But what we can do is look at the environments around some of the coaches and look at how we can influence that to make them as inclusive as possible. So if a player did want to have that conversation, he knows that the support's there, the door is ajar to be able to discuss, whether it's the sexual orientation or gender identity or anything. So I don't think it's just this issue. I think there's definitely a massive issue around communication in general. We've seen that happen with sort of mental health and how we'll be able to tackle that. And that's through conversation and letting people know that the lines of support are actually there. So yeah, the things that we can control are the environments around players, and particularly in the game. And we could definitely do a better job at kind of ensuring that players know that they're supported. And they know that it's a safe environment to be able to be themselves.
Cool. Anita, I'm going to come to you on that support. The idea that coming out in sport, coming out in football in particular, and whether it's the men's games or women's games, you do have clubs that are going to be behind people. I suppose one of the questions that I've always had is why you do see more white athletes kind of taking the spotlight in these situations. Is it because there isn't that same level of behind the scenes support for those who are Black, Asian, people of color?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. I think potentially that's the case because, you know, especially in the women's game currently, there's a huge decline in players who are Black or from ethnic minorities in the elite game, the women's game. So, but that's also existing in the, you know, in terms of the environment around us, from backroom staff to management to operations, CEOs, they're not there. So sometimes it's a case of if you don't have people you can relate to or you feel will understand you as well from your own cultural backgrounds, your own, you know, religion, whatever, you know, you don't have those people you can have those conversations with, then you probably unlikely to want to stand out, you know, because already you're a minority and it's maybe difficult for you in that situation to be that person that takes on the issue, being a minority plus your sexuality or your gender identity as well as trying to be an elite athlete or an athlete that's competing. So there's a lot of weight to carry and a lot of emotional burden that sometimes, you know, you need that support around you for. allies and people around you who can take that away from you and support you in that. So I absolutely think that is probably one of the main reasons as well. But, you know, everything is interconnected in some way. So those players who are able to come out and use their platform and get the support and the platform to do it in the first place, it just doesn't necessarily exist for other players from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds, where they're not being approached or targeted in the same way to lead this campaign. You know, you see that in all areas when it in respect to sponsorship deals, in respect to a lot of other areas. So this is much wider than just the football issue. It's football plus stakeholders plus media, broadcasting, interlinked. And as long as those, we don't have people in those spaces as well, they can't necessarily provide a platform for us to share our narratives either, and create those cultural shifts that we need within the wider game. So I think in that respect, that we've got a long way to go there as well. Not to say there aren't people working really hard behind the scenes who aren't from the same background or race identity. They're there, but you know, they also need support, and they need to be able to understand and feel that they can open up the conversation without offending as well. So, or you know, so that's also the challenge. And in my experience, I found that most players are just found more security in doing it amongst their own teammates. You know, we spend the most time together all the time, and we get to know each other on a deeper personal level. And you might not always get that interaction with your coaches or backroom staff where you trust them enough to share that part of you.
Thank you for sharing that. Chris, I'm going to come to you next. So looking at what Anita was saying, do you think that's a priority at your club? Is there a push for, yes, it would be great for more LGBT athletes, but actually it would be even better if they were Black or a person of color, because we're seeing less of those experiences platformed?
I think from our club's point of view, we don't, as long as you can control and pass it and score, we're not really worried about, you know, anything other than that, really. But as far as I agree with Anita, I think that there's a mixture of issues. And as I said before, I think this is one that gets marginalised with all the issues of discrimination. I think it gets marginalised because everybody in every culture has the same discriminatory issues within it. So it becomes normalised to discriminate against people who are either trans or bi or homosexual. It becomes normalised within the vicarious way that people live their lives through their sons and daughters and friends. So a lot of the times people are actually living their lives that way, and if they don't agree with it within themselves, it's very easy for them to say. Very easy, because that's the way society is. That this issue is very easy for people to say, because it would appear that most people agree with the people that are not supportive. So it's very easy for people to say. So therefore, it becomes a major barrier for anybody who wants to come out or anybody who wants to discuss it, because who do they actually turn to? Even their closest friends may not be an ear to turn to because of the flippant language that they would use on a day-to-day basis. So within our club, I'm not saying that we actually tackle this particular issue. We tend to tackle most issues as a way of living your life with acceptance of others, and making sure that you don't, I wouldn't say don't offend anybody, but make sure that people live their lives in the way that they want to live their lives. And what you will find is that most of us haven't got a clue about it. And if anyone's saying to me, any other footballers are saying, oh yeah, we have. No, we haven't got a clue. We haven't got a clue. We're fumbling around the area, and we're trying to find the best way, the best language to use, the best way of dealing with accepting others. Because even though we think there's been a lot of change, it is still very slow. It's very slow. Like a lot of the things that we look at governing bodies about changing things, they're always talking about evolution of this and evolution of that. Sometimes there needs to be some radical changes and also some education within the clubs. Every Friday we do a life skills thing where we invite people in from different lives to give the players a better view. And this is one of the areas that we were talking about trying to be more educated in, because like Nicky said, statistically there has to be people waiting to come out, and wouldn't it be great if they felt comfortable coming out without any barriers or without anyone batting an eyelid? The easiest one is if no one bats an eyelid, because that tells me that there's been real acceptance. When there's a big party and a furore, it's almost admitting that you were so far behind that you have to have a party about it. So till we get to the point where it's so what, in a positive way, so what, not in a negative way, so what, yeah, and then, you know, till we get to that point, we're gonna be struggling to educate the players. And just lastly on that subject, we've also got to realise that the players are young and they go back to their houses. And if you've got family issues who may not be accepting of others, also holding back. So that's why, because of there's so many issues, this is one that gets marginalised all the time, in my opinion.
Right, that was really honest. I really like that. Thank you. Robbie, I'm going to come to you. Now, on what Chris was saying, I'm guessing at Stonewall there's like a really dusty folder that's there that says what to do when a man comes out in this game, and you're going to like suddenly whip it open. There's going to be like media campaigns. You're going to do this program, that program, whatever program. And what Chris was saying there was that actually having all these attention and having these parties and these celebrations may prevent people from coming out. So is it going to be an approach where we shouldn't pay attention, shouldn't do panels like this, even talking about it, because it's adding in a level of pressure to it? What do you think?
How did you know about our dusty folder, Ben? So, I mean, it's obviously, you know, like any big organization will kind of plan scenarios and think about kind of how you respond to situations that you know are likely to kind of happen and at some point and are likely to be big news stories. I think that probably the key thing that I would say is that it will always kind of come down to the individual, and it will always, you know, for Stonewall, we're kind of here to help any individual kind of who has a kind of public profile to navigate what coming out looks like for them, kind of understand what their options are, and to kind of find a way of doing it that makes sense for them. So I think we're kind of here to help is kind of my key message. And if someone is kind of thinking about it and is thinking about, oh my God, it's so scary, I don't want to be that person, you know, if you're in control of your story, you don't have to be that person. You can do it in a way that kind of suits you and suits your life and suits your family and all the things that are important to you. You know, and I think what I kind of worry about is if someone doesn't have a choice about kind of how it happens, and I think that's kind of, you know, like I think we've seen some really a real mixture of ways that this kind of issue is covered by the media. It's a really kind of mixed picture, and some media have listened to us kind of saying like, please don't sensationalize too much, it's making it harder. But some just can't control themselves, and they just, you know, I think we all remember that gay footballer kind of story from last summer, and that really did the rounds. I think the way that was covered often by a lot of news desks rather than sport desks probably kind of put a lot of fear if people were kind of mulling over their options. I think they saw how that was covered and thought, geez, I don't want that to be me. I don't want to be at the center of a story like that. So I think there's I'd say you can control it, but sometimes you can't. And for those, you know, if you are kind of worried about kind of how your story might get told, I think the best thing to do is to talk to someone like Stonewall, who've got connections both across football and the media, and we can kind of plan that together and kind of try and get the best outcome for you.
See, I told you, yeah, that folder's going to get dusted off nicely. You are ready for that. Nicky, let's talk about the media. How much do you think that the media is to play in holding people back? Is there more that the media could be doing to make this a supportive environment?
I mean, yes, but I struggle with questions in any context that try to talk about the media as one homogenous group when it isn't. I mean, the media wasn't one homogenous group when we had a group of different newspapers that covered sport and life in the UK. It certainly isn't now when you have online outlets, radio outlets, TV outlets. They've all got their own different voices, their own different people in charge. You can't. It's too unwieldy. It's too big to imagine that you can coordinate that in some way, and to expect the media to speak together. It isn't how. I mean, what even is the media anymore? Frankly, sometimes there's so many ways for anyone to share of themselves on the internet, and lots of non-traditional media sources that people go to now ahead of what we would have think of as the traditional media sources. It's a really complex area. Speaking to what Robbie just said, like, I know for me the greatest privilege by far that I had in my coming out was knowing that because I write, I could put it in my own words, and because I write, I had places, and The Guardian was the natural home. I'm a freelancer, but I've written there since 2006, where I could go to an editor and say, hey, like, can I have the space to do this in a way that I want to do it? And I still bluntly found that possibly the most terrifying thing that I've had to do in my life. It was not something that I would, I said at the beginning, I wouldn't have chosen to come out when I came out. I came out because I felt like there was no other way forward. I was where I was, and it was going to happen. And so the choice was exactly as Robbie says: do I take control of this and make it my story as much as I can, or do I just ignore it until somebody else takes charge of it, and the rumor mill takes charge of it, and it becomes something that I can't even attempt to control. So I would have tremendous empathy with any footballer who was gay and took the choice to be like, no, I'm just going to keep this to myself because it doesn't need to be public. I understand that on a visceral level. I understand why you'd make that decision. I understand why you would fear the media, because again, while I stress the media is not one thing, the media is many, many different people speaking with many, many different voices. There are enough of those voices that have caused negativity, that have spoken about all sorts of issues in unhelpful ways, but certainly LGBT issues in unhelpful ways. I understand how hard it would be if you didn't have a person who you trusted absolutely, explicitly, implicitly, every way to tell your story in a way that you would want it to. I think not having that would make this so daunting. And I hope that the message that Robbie is trying to share there would get through, that there are people who sincerely, because I think, again, I'm sure not every person who is LGBT would have this empathy, but a lot of people who've gone through these experiences can feel some empathy for you. I'm not saying come to me either, by the way, but I'm not a professional footballer, but I can empathize with some of what a person has gone through who's doing that. So there are people there who you can talk to. There are people who will take your words in confidence. There are people who will help you to do this in a good way. But I understand why it's terrifying, and I don't know honestly that there's a way that can make it not terrifying, because I think coming out for all of us anywhere in the LGBT spectrum, I think all of us have some part of that that's terrifying at some point, whether that's the public or that's our families. So yeah, it's pretty complicated.
And on that complication, I'm going to go to Anita on this. Clearly, all of these responses have been wonderful, all very nice, but there's something that's not working. Something isn't right with the men's game. And I suppose, what do you think that is? Like, what is holding back people? Where have we gone wrong?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a really, we know this is a long problem that's gone on generationally in football. And I think part of it is probably the same way that football doesn't tackle racism, in a way, I would say, that the rules that apply to the game on and off the pitch, the way we address behavior that is negative by fans or players, in the same way, needs to be somewhat controlled in a kind of policy way by governing bodies, but I think also within clubs. So not tolerating if a player or the player culture environment is that of bullying or belittling or undermining people because of their sexuality, related to coaches as well and backroom staff or whatever. I think football probably hasn't done enough in those areas to try and make the environment as secure and open in the way that Chris has described, where you just talk about acceptance, you know, recognizing why they're all there as athletes, because they're the best, because they're good enough, because they're committed, because they give 100%, regardless about, you know, their sexuality or gender identity. The focus on sexualizing things about people is an issue in our culture in general. If we could steer away from this idea of that, it always comes back to, you know, who we date, who we're married to, all these things in our professional environment, maybe that would also shift the conversation a bit more. Because, you know, I saw it the other day, I think BBC did a TV show with an ex-Love Island contestant and was asking her, like, which one of these Arsenal players would you marry? As opposed to just treating her as a football fan who happens to be female, who probably has great knowledge, better knowledge than, say, my cousins who don't particularly like football, who happen to be male. When we can get to this normality within our culture and our society, I think football will also improve in this area. So yeah, I think ultimately that's what it comes down to. What are the checks and balances within the culture in clubs, within governing bodies, to really make sure that individuals are protected, you know, related to this issue. That if they come to you and they say, by the way, I can't handle the language that often is masked in banter, it is affecting me, you know, as an individual, but it sometimes affects those individuals' performance as well. So it is a big issue, because these are the things that inhibit people from being 100% themselves as people, off the pitch, on the pitch sometimes. So I think that's crucial for football to think about that too, because sometimes they might even see their own players, you know, within a pre-season doing really well, and then it comes to matches or something, and something significant has changed in their performance or in their behavior. And it could be related to the journeys that we talk about when you're going through your own sexual identity and all those things, gender identity questions, that coaches and people should be free to have these discussions and support players and understand, actually, is it just performance and training that maybe is affecting this individual? Is it things outside of that is also contributing to that?
Oh, and I like that you added some clubs in there as well, because yeah, I think it does definitely. Of course, it would impact performance. If you're struggling with these things off the pitch, it's going to affect your game on the pitch. Yeah. So, Chris, let's talk about this. What do you think you would do if a player in your first team was to come to you, or maybe they have? Not speculating, but if a player was to come to you and say that, look, this is what I'm going through, this is what I'm dealing with, what do you think I should do? What would you do in that circumstance?
What would I do if they thought it was going to be made public? You mean? If they thought it was going to be made public, I would probably phone Nicky, because as she said, there's empathy there. To understand it, and I would phone somebody I thought that had. I wouldn't try to deal with it myself, because I would be being naive to think I could solve his problems in this issue. So I would probably try and signpost him to somebody who could actually help him to deal with it. Now, if the only problem was the fact that he felt it was going to go public, and it was the publicity that was going to cause a problem, then obviously that would be something I'd have to let the professionals who know how to deal with that. If it was something that he was going through and emotionally, obviously I would try to help him to feel that he's not doing anything that is wrong or abnormal or anything like that. From my personal point of view as a human being, and then if I felt that he needed to speak to somebody who could probably give him a better way of navigating around the situation, I would probably look for somebody that I trust. In my family, there are people who've been through this. So, you know, and I can't begin to think how they would navigate around this themselves. But I think that stumbling around it as someone who has no clue about what they're going through would be wrong. I think you'd be better off trying to find somebody you can trust who's been through a similar situation and assist as best you can. Because I'm only coming in from my point of view, from the point of view as being someone who's going to accept anybody for anything they want to do. So maybe I'm coming from it from a little bit of a Disneyland perspective.
Well, maybe, and I suppose that is the bigger question, isn't it? Is like, are clubs actually preparing people and putting them in the right environment to let something like this happen? Surely, when you're setting a tone for the changing rooms, you're setting the tone for the team meetings, there must be something that isn't right in what's currently happening that is preventing people from moving forward and feeling more accepted. I mean, if you look at the women's game, like that has to be the case, right?
Well, the culture of the whole game. I mean, one of the things I think that people are frightened of, not only the fact of being ridiculed, you know, in the stands. I think the violence comes into it. Because a lot of people will still attack you, you know, if they think you're gay. People will still attack people from that point of view, and I think that has a lot to play in it. You know, no one ever talks about that, but well, people do talk about it, but it's not an issue at the front of it. Violence among the gay community, against the gay community, against the trans community, is huge. You know, people actually seeking people out to beat up for those misplaced views. So I think a lot of people don't actually reveal themselves because of that as well. It's not only about what may come out.
Nice. I'm going to go to Jay next, because it's not all bad news. We've got local groups, we've got LGBT leagues. Things are getting better in lots of different ways. And I suppose I just want to reflect on the positivity. It's not all trauma and bad vibes. So tell me a bit about some of the good stuff that's happening when we talk about sexuality, gender identity in football.
Yeah, I think along with when we're talking about sort of campaigns and initiatives that have kind of shifted the discourse forward more positively, I think you've got to put LGBT fan groups and LGBT inclusive football clubs at the centre of that also. When we're talking about providing visibility from a grassroots level, so this is like the majority of where football happens is a grassroots level. And you've got clubs up and down the country, from Manchester to Liverpool to London. You've got many based in London to Newcastle, Cardiff. These are all LGBT clubs who have always existed, well, not always existed, but have existed and grown over the last few years, particularly from a membership perspective. And people are starting to highlight the importance of these places, particularly as an LGBT person who potentially grows up thinking that sport isn't a place for them. I remember when I sort of first found an LGBT football club, I couldn't believe that there was another gay guy who plays football. It was absolutely mind-blowing to me. And then the closer I got to the LGBT community, the more I understood some of the really challenging experiences that they've had within football. And for me, I'm really, really passionate about football. Like I said earlier, coming out in football would change my life. I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for football. And the idea that there's a massive group of LGBT people who haven't had that privilege, who haven't been engaged with such a powerful sport for what it does to me, and this isn't just with football, it's with sport as a whole. There's a massive community of people who are completely disengaged. I was quite passionate about being able to bridge that gap. So when you're talking about LGBT football clubs, such an important space that they're providing, particularly from an educational and visibility perspective. And when we're looking at LGBT fan groups as well, I think record number of LGBT fan groups who are visible at games on a weekly basis. And when we're looking at and talking about the absence of visible role models actually on the football pitch, the closest you've got to visible visibility are those LGBT fan groups. They're the people in the stands who have their pride banners and their fan group logos up, and that visualization is incredibly powerful, not just from a perspective of being able to police some of the challenging aspects of terrorist culture, but also being able to provide that safety net from a player, particularly if they might be in the closet and they just see that banner. That could be a really, really powerful kind of visual for them to understand or acknowledge that their club actually has a connection to LGBT communities, and there are actually other LGBT people within these grounds. So yeah, you can never underestimate the power that these fan groups and the LGBT inclusive football clubs up and down the country have. And yeah, it's really, really grateful for the experience that they've gave me, and long may they continue. And yeah, I'm glad that they continue to get bigger and more visible.
Love that. Okay, so we're actually at 1 hour. So I'm gonna add on one more, because I do think there's something to be said around trans inclusion in sport, and I'd really like to hear from both Nicky and Robbie actually. Firstly, Nicky, do you think it's too soon to be having this conversation around trans inclusion in sport, when actually, if we look at what the government's planning to do, when we look at society as a whole, it seems like the conversation about trans even being a thing hasn't really started yet. It hasn't progressed to that point yet. So is it too soon to almost then discuss such a specific thing as trans inclusion in sport?
No, it's not too soon to discuss anything. I mean, trans people are involved in sport. Trans people are participating in sport today. That has been happening for years. People are suddenly talking about it more, but there are plenty. I know several trans women competing in amateur football. I know a couple of trans men competing in amateur football. There are no doubt a huge number more than I know. And the reality is that, as I sort of said at the beginning when I talked about my experience, contrary to how this conversation can seem online sometimes, a lot of people just don't care and want everyone to be able to live their lives happily. And that is, I think, still a really important message to people who are scared is and I understand it, of coming out, of trying to live their lives as they want to, is that a lot of society, the majority of society, frankly, in my opinion, is just trying to get on with their own lives and doesn't even pay that much attention to what you're doing. But a lot of society is more accepting than you might imagine. I don't think this is a subject that we can take lightly. Having said that, I think it's an important subject. It is a challenging subject. I think there are aspects of it that need to be considered from, I guess, a medical standpoint, because there are aspects of testosterone and what that does to your body that the IOC has considered, that the Football Association have considered, that are written into their guidelines even now. So these things have to be considered and they have to be talked about. And I think the best way for those things to be talked about in general is by doctors and by people who understand the detail of that, rather than in a sort of public forum way, which can lend itself to mudslinging, to people shaming people for how they look, frankly, rather than addressing the important aspect of what this should really be about, which is player safety. Is it safe for people to be taking part in sport together? Because really, that's got to be the most important driving part of this. We want people to play sport. We want people to enjoy playing sport. We want people to be safe playing sport. That seems like that should be the driving ethos. I think there's room for nuance in this conversation. I think that nuance gets lost so easily on social media, in sensational newspaper headlines, in comment pieces that don't bother to get into the detail of things, that don't bother to talk to people with lived experiences. I think there's room for a lot of nuance. There's room for a discussion about whether rules need to be the same for elite sport as they are for amateur sport, for instance. I think that's an area that, again, needs to be thought about delicately, needs to be discussed by people whose primary concerns are, frankly, safeguarding and making sure that the sport can thrive in a way that is good for everybody. And I think there are people having those conversations, and I find it incredibly frustrating when the people who are having those conversations get ignored and shouted down for the sake of some sensationalism, which there is plenty of. But yes, I think it's important for all of us to acknowledge the complexity of this topic, to acknowledge the sensitivity of this topic, to start with the premise that what we want is for the maximum number of people, for all people, frankly, to be able to participate in sport if they want to, and to be comfortable participating in sport if they want to. And if we start with that as our guiding idea, then good will trickle down from that.
Love that positivity. So, Robbie, when the average person, the average fan, sports fan, doesn't understand the Equality Act, doesn't understand the Gender Recognition Act, doesn't really understand what it means to be a trans person, do you think it's too soon to start this conversation about trans people in sports and professional sports, when ultimately there's such a lack of understanding that it almost just jumps to judgment and shaming?
So I'm kind of with Nicky, actually, that, like, we're all here because we love sport, and we all see the power of sport to bring communities together. And, it's probably a way that all of us kind of mix with a broader group of people than we do in any other aspect of our lives as well. I think sport has that huge potential. So I will always kind of say it's never too soon. We just need to do it in a kind of careful and considered way, because it's a sensitive conversation, and I wouldn't want to do anything that kind of puts trans people at more risk than they are currently at the moment. And so that's kind of one of my guiding principles, is just kind of think about how you minimize the risk for communities who are facing a lot of kind of hardship. There's some really interesting polling that I saw over the weekend, which is about kind of how people in Britain consider trans people. And actually, if you look at other European countries, Britain has one of the highest rates, and actually a really good rate of acceptance for trans communities. People saying that they would accept a trans colleague, a trans co-worker, a trans family member. It's actually really, really high. And I think we just need to remember that actually people are ready to accept what you kind of see on social media and what you see on certain publications and their comment pages is not representative of society. So I think we're more ready to have that conversation, but I think it needs to be a kind of a grassroots led conversation. I think the focus on elite sport in particular is almost like a kind of a purposeful distraction. Most of us aren't, apart from people on this call, aren't going to be anywhere near elite sport. Most of us, exactly. We won't be anywhere near kind of qualifying for anything. But we follow sport because we love it and we get a sense of community from it. So I think the conversation really needs to be about how do we make our sport communities trans inclusive. And actually, I think you'll probably find that a lot of them are already on the way there. They just need a little bit more confidence, a little bit more cajoling and support. And that's where kind of campaigns like Rainbow Laces make all the difference. It's a chance to kind of celebrate the diversity of your sports community, the diversity that is already there, and the good things that you're already doing to make people feel welcome and inclusive. And I think for me, it's just about kind of showing that we can do this. We're already doing it. We just need to feel more confident and be more conscious about how we go about trans inclusion.
Yes. Well, thank you so much to all of the panelists. It was a really deep and juicy conversation around this. So thank you for joining me. And for Jay's final thought, I'm going to pass over to Jay to wrap this up. But thank you so, so much.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you for all the panelists for being a part of this conversation. Just to reiterate what Ben said, incredible conversations and really, really great insights. It's been a pleasure to be involved with it with you. I'm hoping we can expand on this conversation and go into a little bit more in depth in some other areas later on in the future. Please keep in touch. Thank you all again.
You're so, so welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
See you
Take
later.
care. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.